I adore dreams, even though dreams can be nightmares, which is what mine usually are. They are strewn with obstacles which I know and recognize, but it doesn't matter to me. This craziness for dreams, the pleasure of dreaming, which I have never tried to explain, is one of the deep-seated tendencies which have led me to surrealism.
With these words, the Spanish film director Luis Buñuel describes what inspired Un Chien Andalou, or the Andalusian dog, considered the first and the most authentic of surrealist films. But in doing so, Buñuel also acknowledges one of the core tenets of the surrealist movement, the power of dreams to drive the creative process. Surrealism, a coined term for superrealism, made its quirky mark on the creative world a century ago, and traces of it can still be found today in music videos, CD cover art, and Hollywood films. The movement's philosophy was a heady brew of many big ideas distilled from the last century's intellectual history, from socialism to psychoanalysis. And, like the century itself, the movement was born of crisis. The early 1900s were an exciting time in the art world. Modernist movements emerged that were dedicated to putting an end to a formal and academic approach to art. Their aim was to knock art off its pedestal and bring it closer to the average person on the street. Expressionism, Cubism, and Futurism challenged not only the status quo, but the rule of reason. And then an event occurred that shook the world to its foundations and fully demonstrated the utter failure of reason. It was the First World War.
It's really hard for us today to understand exactly how important that was and really what a traumatic event World War I was. It was the most devastating war particularly for the middle and upper classes. It was a war fought without modern antibiotics and without modern anesthetics and with modern weapons. And furthermore, it was the only war that was fought on a global scale with what we would now call weapons of mass destruction. So people died, and those who didn't die were permanently scarred, and so much of the generation that went in and actually fought the war could not forgive their elders, could not forgive the society that made the war possible. In extreme cases, could not forgive the human race for having produced this horrible thing that they had gone through, or if they hadn't gone through it, their friends had gone through it. In some cases, their parents had gone through it. And so in huge sectors of, particularly in the middle classes and the upper middle classes, there was just this enormous rejection. And people who would at other times have gone into whatever the family business was became artists, or became politicians, or became bohemians with no particular employments, or became criminals. So the violent anti-social, anti-political feelings that you see manifested in so many works of art after World War I are connected with the terrible feelings that people had about the war. It's really hard to imagine how awful it was, how traumatized people were.
Aside from the war, there were many other seismic influences which encouraged artists to challenge the established order. The communist revolution in Russia, sparked by the writings of Karl Marx, signaled that the reign of kings, cardinals, and aristocrats was over, and that power now belonged to the people. And in Vienna, the theories of Sigmund Freud raised existential questions about sexuality, the role of religion, and the nature of mental illness. He also promoted the interpretation of dreams as the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind.
Marx and Freud were the spiritual godfathers of the Surrealists. They devoured their works, though at different times it depended on context. At first, in the first years of the movement, it was more Freud. And then slowly, as the political situation in Europe got worse and worse, then they would read more Marx. From Freud, they got the idea that human behavior was based on sex and aggression, and from Marx, they got the idea that the goal of any reasonable person was to transform society. The whole point would be to change it. They would try different ways of putting these two masters together, and it's amazing how modern that is. English departments, language departments throughout the world are dominated, I think, by people who are still trying to find the magic theory that will integrate Marx and Freud, and the Surrealists got there first.
But before there were the Surrealists, there was another group of alienated and rebellious intellectuals who served as the godfathers of Surrealism. They were the Dadaists. Dadaism was founded in Zurich by a group of artists who had taken part in the war. They opposed the political and artistic order that was responsible for that monstrous conflict. Their leader, the Romanian poet Tristan Tzara, stated that thought is born in the mouth. They sought to change things through a new form of communication. Legend has it that Tzara and some others christened their movement by picking a name at random out of the dictionary. Dada, the French word for rocking horse. They called their movement Dadaism. The date was the 8th of February, 1916, and their iconoclastic theories soon spread across the cultural landscape. Their anthem was, "If destruction exists, we must destroy everything." They held demonstrations, art exhibits, and literary readings. They championed an automatic approach to poetry that caused them to write whatever words and thoughts popped into their heads. Anything was valid. Anything was art. This anarchy meets art movement recruited eager followers in Berlin, Cologne, and New York. But it was in the City of Light where the subversive groundswell of Dadaism found the warmest welcome.
Paris was important in so many different ways. This is one of those things in world history that's just determined by a lot of different things. Paris was centrally located so that people from America could get there, people from Spain could get there, people from Germany could get there. Of course, Paris had this tremendous bohemian community that you see almost parodied in Puccini's opera La Bohème, and which everybody knew about. Paris was a place where you could live cheaply, which is very, very important for an artist or anyone who's just living on an allowance from their family, as so many of the would-be artists were. And it was the intellectual capital of Europe. Therefore, not just Surrealism, but people from all kinds of orientations, all kinds of places came to Paris, and Dada and Surrealism were international movements.
This climate was exactly right for the nurturing of Dadaism. Here in the capital of Western art, the Dadaists mocked convention by mounting a series of provocative exhibitions. These shows, with their rejection of every accepted art form and artist, wiped away centuries of aesthetic tradition. Simply put, the aim was to destroy all traditional values. In New York, the French artist Marcel Duchamp submitted a porcelain urinal to a 1917 exhibition and called it Fountain. When he returned to Paris, he exhibited a Da Vinci icon with a definite Dadaist touch. Among all the art forms, film offered the ideal weapon for Dadaism's anti-establishment spirit of destruction. This was because watching flickering images in a darkened room is very close to having a communal, dreamlike experience. Film also offered the Dadaists a sure way to spread their iconoclasm among the masses, and the plastic nature of the medium provided them an easy way to distort reality. So they swiftly threw themselves into the pursuit of new production approaches that rebelled against the typical narrative films of the time. In the very early days of the film industry, the camera simply captured a story that unfolded before its fixed and locked-down lens, just as it would a play on a stage. There was the occasional medium close-up, but wide shots were the norm. Then, innovators like America's D.W. Griffith, with films like Birth of a Nation in 1915, began to change things. They told their stories with all of the precision of a novel, using a deft blend of shots, including the close-up, to show psychological struggle, and well-written title cards for narration and dialogue. In doing so, they created the classic narrative model for film followed today. But whether it was the novels of Dostoevsky or the films of Griffith, the avant-garde artists, including the Dadaists, revolted against any attempt at establishing a classical model. In 1923, the American photographer and painter Man Ray, then living in Paris, produced the first Dadaist film. As he describes it,
I got hold of a 30-meter roll of film, sat down in a dark room, cut the film into strips, and nailed them down on the table. I sprinkled a few of the strips with salt and pepper like a chef preparing a roast. I randomly threw some nails and tacks onto the rest of them. I then exposed them to the light for a few seconds.
Man Ray gave his work the ironic title, Le Retour à la Raison, The Return to Reason. Tristan Tzara presented the film in Paris and had caused a great uproar, which was just what the Dadaists wanted. But to best understand Ray's and Tzara's efforts, one must also understand their cultural context, not just within Dadaism, but within the vibrant alternative cinema movement of the time. Other artists turned filmmakers had declared their opposition to the conventional methods of expression in art and the cinema. These avant-garde directors generally came from the world of painting and considered the cinema to be merely an extension of it. For them, the image was to be the principal tool of narration. In 1910, the painter Arnaldo Giannani had been one of the first to pioneer abstract cinema by painting directly onto unexposed film. But his discoveries had to wait another 10 years before other cinematographic painters would embrace this attempt to generate pure visual rhythms in the new plastic art of film. In 1924, a film by the French artist Fernand Léger, in collaboration with the North American Dudley Murphy, captured the Cubist vision on film. They called it ballet mécanique, and although not purely abstract, it rejected a scripted approach. Léger said that the script is in error, and without it, the cinema can be turned into a microscope of what has never been seen before. In the film, he choreographs a disjointed dance of disparate images. Some were metaphors for the new industrial society, which was rapidly transforming the world. In 1924, the painter Francis Picabia, with the help of the cinema producer René Clair and the composer Erik Satie, produced Entr'acte. The film mixed meaningless images with strange scenes involving persecution and a runaway funeral carriage that could be right out of a Mack Sennett chase sequence. There was a good reason for this. The Surrealists were big fans of American comedies because of their sense of the absurd and willingness to poke fun at the stuffed shirts at the top of the social order. At the end of Entr'acte, the corpse rises and then makes everyone else disappear. The actors were Dadaists such as Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp. Anemic cinema was another Dadaist creation from the fertile minds of Duchamp and Ray. The 7-minute film featured a series of spinning vortex-like circles that sequentially cut or faded to a revolving disc on which words were written in a way to create linguistic puns. Anemic cinema contained some surrealist elements, so it is hard to define the actual moment of transition from Dadaism to surrealism in cinema or even in art and literature. Both movements had similar lines of development and showed the same fierce opposition to the established rules. But a watershed event occurred that served to separate followers into two camps. Some members, led by the psychologist turned poet André Breton, felt they wanted to take experimentation much further and openly broke with Tzara's Dadaist group. Breton established the aims of the new movement in his 1924 Manifesto of Surrealism. Here he defined surrealism, a word which had been used some years before by the French avant-garde poet Guillaume Apollinaire. For Breton, this superrealism was pure psychic automatism, in which one aims to express, whether it be verbally, in writing, or in any other way, the actual way in which thought processes function. Dictated by thought, far removed from every calculation of reason, and not subject to any aesthetic or moral concerns. In his manifesto, Breton stated that he was an enemy of realism, and that he was against talent and in favor of imagination, which he called the mad lady in the house.
Breton's manifesto, like all of the writings of surrealism, would have had well, I hate to use the D word, but a dialectical relationship with what people were producing. None of the writings were cookbooks. None of them said, well, this is what you should do, and you take 2 parts of this and 4 parts of that. That was absolutely anathema to the surrealists. The whole idea was that you found favorable ways of producing things, and then the reality came out of your mind. It came out of your unconscious. And the whole idea was to find ways in which you could liberate the unconscious and find new ways of expressing the collective urges that would somehow produce the new world. So the Surrealist manifestos weren't ways of saying what you should do, though there's a lot of hints in them as to what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't do anything that's at all like the traditional novel, for example. You shouldn't do anything that's classic bourgeois representation. And no one could say exactly in advance how to do that. The Surrealists had various ways of trying to get to this new kind of content. They kept dream diaries, they practiced automatic writing, but it would clearly be a contradiction in terms to be a surrealist and to have some kind of cookbook. The whole idea was to discover new territory.
Using Sigmund Freud's theories as their starting point for exploring this pure psychic automatism, the Surrealists championed the supreme power of the subconscious. They also advocated the destruction of all logic, as well as religion, morality, and family, and proposed that everything which prevented man from living according to his own desires should be dismantled. In 1927, Germaine Dulac, a feminist impressionist director with some 20 films already under her belt, attempted to make the first true surrealist film. She called it La Coquille et le Clergyman, and it was based on a script by Antonin Artaud. Unlike other surrealist efforts, the film actually had a plot that centered on a clergyman who was obsessed with a general's wife and conflicted by his own erotic desires. Dulac introduced some special effects to create imagery that itself was quite surreal. In 1928, Man Ray produced L'Étoile de Mer, using a poem by Robert Deneau as his inspiration. The film's characters, presented within a dreamlike reality, were played by Man Ray and the famous model Kiki du Montparnasse, a friend of Ray's. Neither La Coquille et le Clergyman nor L'Étoile de Mer nor any other contemporary film was embraced by the movement as prime exemplars of the Surrealist credo. However, it became obvious to them that film offered the best avenue for defining their philosophy.
What they really liked about cinema was it was a popular art, and the Surrealists had, in theory at least, a left-wing, an extreme left-wing agenda, and didn't approve of bourgeois culture and did approve of working-class culture, and the cinema was an art that the parts of it that they liked, at least, appealed to the working classes, or so they thought. So they liked the social aspect of cinema. Another aspect of cinema that would have appealed to them was that you consumed it in a group, and that it was typically made by more than one person. And the Surrealists believed that the whole idea of art as expressing an individual and an individual's thoughts, the romantic tradition of the arts, they rejected that completely. And the cinema as typically made by more than one person and viewed by more than one person also would have had great appeal in that way. The most important Surrealist writings about the cinema, too, were mostly negative. What's wrong with certain kinds of cinema? They didn't like the kind of mid-brow, respectable period pictures, and they didn't, above all, they didn't like the other avant-garde that was in Paris at the same time. And so the writings about film staked out territory, but didn't really provide a positive program. How could you? The program is supposed to be surprising. It's supposed to come out of some new, as yet undiscovered place.
And that is exactly what happened in the mid-1920s when two young Spaniards came to Paris from Madrid, where they had been members of an artist group that included the poet and playwright Federico Garcia Lorca. Luis Buñuel and the Catalan painter Salvador Dalí soaked up the heady theories discussed in the local cafes and soon collaborated on the 1929 production of Un Chien Andalou, touted by the movement as the first true Surrealist film. Paradoxically, neither Buñuel nor Dalí was an active member of the movement at the time. This is how Buñuel remembered the creative process.
The film came about as a result of combining two dreams. Dalí invited me to spend a few days at his house, and when I arrived at Figueras, I told him all about a dream I had had shortly before, in which a pure white cloud cut through the moon and the razor cut into an eye. He then told me that the night before in his dream he had seen a hand covered in ants. Then he said, "Why don't we use that as the starting point for a film?"
Filled with bizarre and unsettling images, the film is a tale of confusing identity, sexual repression, and mutilation. Buñuel and Dalí wrote the script in 3 days in accordance with set rules. Both had to be in agreement. No idea with a rational explanation was to be accepted, and any image which merely made an impression on them was to be used, without any attempt to discover why.
Buñuel's position as a central actor in the Surrealist film movement is unquestioned, and it's maybe, I think, best to think of Surrealist film as a kind of riddle. What would a Surrealist film be? So no one knew what it was, and Buñuel finally appears to have solved the riddle, how to make a film that would feel surrealist. For the Surrealists, the definition of Surrealist film was a bit like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. You can't say exactly what it is, but you know it when you see it. And Buñuel made Un Chien Andalou, and people said, that's it. Now today, we can speculate on why that was it. But at the time, all people knew was someone had finally done it. Someone had finally solved the mystery of how to get this kind of feeling that they were looking for in a movie. In terms of cinematic technique, the solution to the riddle of Surrealist film that Buñuel found was counterintuitive. Other people had been trying to use avant-garde techniques like superimposition and slow motion photography to get a surrealist effect. But the most wildly surrealist things in Buñuel's films are gotten typically by very classical, ordinary, narrative techniques. For example, the big one is match cutting. Buñuel can make a room suddenly expand simply by using a match cut. Now, a match cut is a cut where the audience doesn't really see it because there's a match either on action or on a character seen from a slightly different point of view. There's a whole repertoire of match cuts, and Buñuel uses practically all of them to get effects like the man is in this apartment and then all of a sudden you cut to a different angle, on the same action, and the apartment is suddenly much bigger, and there are two grand pianos and priests being dragged in that whole part of the scene. And that gets its impact not because there was some kind of fuzzy dissolve to it, because that would have been the way people would have thought to do it before Buñuel, but Buñuel just uses a matter-of-fact, invisible edit, and suddenly it's as if this sudden new scene just appears magically. And the magical effect is gotten by very ordinary means, and this was, I think, Buñuel's genius. Buñuel wanted to make people behave differently. He wanted to make a film that would be a call to revolution. He wanted to change the way people thought. He wanted to change the way people acted. He wanted to get rid of bourgeois repression, which is very funny because all of these people were quite bourgeois and quite repressed. Maybe that's why they wanted revolution so much. And the whole idea was not to make works of art that were simply works of art. Instead, these would be works of revolutionary rhetoric. And certainly, if Buñuel thought of his film and Dali's film in relation to art at all, he thought of it as anti-art, as a way of saying merde to the whole idea of art.
In Paris, Buñuel and Dali met Man Ray, who was looking for something to complement the screening of his latest Surrealist production, Les Mystères du Château de Day. Through him, the young Spaniards gained the support of the key members of the Surrealist movement: André Breton, Louis Aragon, Max Ernst, Paul Éluard, Tristan Tzara, and others who met regularly in the Café Cyrano. Buñuel and Dali soon began their second effort, L'Âge d'Or, although Dali's involvement was minimal because of his personal schedule and a falling out with Buñuel over the project's direction. With these ingredients and guidance from the usual muses of Marx and Freud, Buñuel created the revolutionary document the movement had sought. With it, he reached the pinnacle of achievement in Surrealist cinema. In L'Âge d'Or, Buñuel again systematically attacks the social order with a potent mixture of eroticism and anti-clericalism. His script rejected the classical linear narrative style by dictating a series of images without any logical connection. But with his creative eye, Buñuel perfectly captured both the spirit and the letter of the Surrealist doctrine. The film has a preface featuring documentary footage of scorpions. This is followed by scenes involving bandits, bishops, and an assortment of odd events. The primary narrative thread is about a sexually repressed couple and their futile attempts at lovemaking. This action takes place amidst an aristocratic party in a mansion and the death of a child at the hands of his father. The film's epilogue takes place at a remote castle where debauchery and religious hypocrisy rule the day. L'Âge d'Or was a dark and sordid tale. Although it played to a full house for 6 days after its premiere at Studio 28 in November 1930, the general public found it offensive. A young right-wing mob stormed the cinema, slashed the Surrealist paintings exhibited in the foyer, and threw ink and stink bombs at the screen. In Paris, the conservative press supported this vandalism, and a week later, the film was banned. It was a ban that would last 50 years.
L'Âge d'Or is one of the last works for about 10 years before modernist independent filmmaking is reborn in the United States. And then it is one of the films that's most influential on the American avant-garde. But that gap is very interesting, and like so many things in film history, it's caused by a whole bunch of things happening at once. And modern literary critics would like to call it, using a Freudian term, overdetermined. There was the political context that suddenly the rise of fascism had made the left-wing part of the Surrealist program seem much more important to the Surrealists. It was a lot harder to sort of live and be an independent artist, and fewer people were interested in art. There were, above all, the added costs of making sound films, because L'Âge d'Or is a sound film. Once you added sound and you had sync sound, suddenly you basically quadrupled, and in some cases more than that, the cost of the film.
Since avant-garde cinema operated on the fringes of the industry, financing was always one of the toughest obstacles the artists had to overcome. Sometimes a patron would appear to make a project possible. Vicomte Charles de Noailles financed both La Sangre d'un Poète, the first film by the poet and painter Jean Cocteau, and L'Âge d'Or, at a time when Buñuel was seriously thinking about giving up the cinema because of a lack of funds. It was also difficult to get a distributor for Surrealist films. However, in the mid-1920s, cine clubs began to appear, and these made the exhibition of avant-garde films much easier. Paris clubs like Le Vieux Colombier, Studio des Ursulines, and Studio 28 became places where leading filmgoers regularly met to see and discuss what was new in the cinema. Producing avant-garde films had always been a marginal business because of the small return on investment. Sound recording added to the burden. But quite apart from the question of money, Surrealists had a difficult time accepting sound films because they had always viewed silent movies as perfect conveyors of feelings, freeing them from the restraints of the spoken word. They had no conception of the boundless and creative possibilities of sound mixing, nor of the ways in which words can be used to convey a message that's the opposite of its conventional meaning. Later film pioneers, like the Marx Brothers and the Monty Python troupe, with their use of loony dialogue poking fun at the establishment, would have made any Surrealist smile. After L'Âge d'Or, Buñuel abandoned Surrealist metaphor and produced a social documentary, Tierra sin Pan, in which he featured the strange, poverty-stricken landscape of Las Herdes. And then the Surrealist movement, born amidst the ashes of reason in World War I, the war to end all wars, was shunted aside by more war, first in Spain and then throughout Europe, with the rise of Nazism and fascism. Writers and artists with unconventional viewpoints were censored and persecuted, and members of the Surrealist movement dispersed throughout the world, with many from Breton's group coming to the United States. In film history, the list of authentic Surrealist efforts is rather modest. At the height of the movement, there were no more than half a dozen titles that could be considered surreal, with Buñuel's Un Chien Andalou and L'Âge d'Or at the top of the list. But many other films, including Buñuel's vast oeuvre, contained definite Surrealist elements. One of the most famous is Hitchcock's Spellbound, released in 1945. Its Freudian-based script featured a riveting dream sequence, and none other than Salvador Dalí was called upon to design the set. In 1991's Grand Canyon, director Lawrence Kasdan softly punctuates the film with a lovely dream in which Kevin Kline flies through the downtown canyons of Los Angeles. 1999's Being John Malkovich, written by Charlie Kaufman and directed by Spike Jonze, charmed audiences with its surreal style and sensibility. But are these really modern-day Surrealist films?
The question of whether there have been genuinely Surrealist films made recently is a very complicated one, because Surrealism has become so much a part of the vocabulary of modern filmmaking. You can see references to Un Chien Andalou, for example, in some music videos. That doesn't make them Surrealist. That means that Surrealism has become almost a tradition. But the Surrealists didn't want to be a tradition. They wanted to be a revolution. And they wanted to be a source of innovation. So if you simply cite surrealist imagery, the question is, does that make you surrealist? And I think the answer is probably not. Now, there are a few filmmakers who could be said, I think, to have some form of surrealist impulse. One of them would be David Lynch, for example, who's often cited that way. And there are some surrealist, I think genuinely surrealist elements in the modern horror film tradition, but these are very scattered.
Today, the legacy of surrealism and surrealist films can be found in all areas of popular culture, from ads and print graphics to TV reruns. The best steady sources of new surrealist cinema are local film festivals scattered across the country. Here, participating writers, directors, and producers share the same subversive vision as those artists who wandered this strange and tilted dreamscape in the 1920s and 30s. These modern-day Buñuels may be drawing their inspiration from that same primal need to protest a world gone mad, a world of wars and suffering, a world that, once again, is bereft of all reason.